As everyone is coming in, welcome to the second session of Expanding Empathy 2025 through Penn State University. I'm Daryl Cameron. I run the Consortium on Moral Decision Making here at Penn State, which is an outgrowth and supported by the Rock Ethics Institute, the College of Liberal Arts, the Social Science Research Institute, the Departments of Psychology and Philosophy, and the McCourtney Institute for Democracy. And this is the seventh year of the series. We've been doing this for a long time, trying to bring together scholars in the social sciences and the humanities to talk about empathy and morality, think about ways to highlight how interdisciplinary dialogues about ethics can be interesting, useful, productive, generative, and lead us down interesting rabbit holes and hopefully help us to answer some of the big picture pressing questions. One of the um, one of the big themes this year is to really highlight and showcase how empathy works and why it matters. So last week we had Philip Kanska and Leda Barrio talk about components of empathy and interactions and social life. And I'm really excited this week to have two guests that I think present a different sort of question, namely, how does empathy change and what is its use in social and moral interactions? This has been something that has been, uh, it's been well debated for not just the past 15 years, but like millennia. So it's not a new question. Um, but how do we think about what the use is of empathy? And I think right now, more than ever, like how to consider whether empathy can make us strong or weak, whether it can help us with interactions or make us exploitable, I think is very much in debate, both within science, within ethics, and within the popular national discourse as well. So I have two guests today. I'm really excited to welcome back our first return visitor. So Sara Konrath from Indiana University, the Lilly School of Philanthropy. She was one of our first speakers back in 2019, the very first iteration of the series. And so I'm really pleased to be able to welcome her back for a return talk to kind of update us on how things have gone in the past 5 to 6 years or so. Let me briefly introduce Sara first. So she is a social psychologist who directs the interdisciplinary program on empathy and altruism research at Indiana University's the Lee Family School of Philanthropy. In her work, she focuses on changes over time in social and emotional traits like empathy and concern among American young people and students. She's looked at how these empathic traits can matter for people in a wide variety of ways, looking at health and happiness, benefits of giving. I just saw recently she was involved in the World Happiness Initiative, which they maybe should talk about today. Um, she's also works with various outlets, which I think is really interesting too. Um, we just had a recent alumni visitor who did some work on empathy in theater, one of my former honor students, and she and I were talking, and we brought up your work, Sara, and like how thinking about empathy in art and museums and organizations and how to instill empathy in public life and bridge science and humanities with outreach to the public, which I think is something a lot of folks are talking about right now, especially. She writes a popular Psychology Today blog called The Empathy Gap. Has been featured in places like the New York Times, Time Magazine, NPR, BBC. She has a book coming out called Culture of Burnout: American Life in an Age of Increasing Expectations with Oxford University Press. It has been published by Templeton, the John Templeton Foundation, and others as well. And so let me briefly introduce our other speaker too, so you have a sense for who all's in the room, but then I'll turn it over to Dr. Konrath. So our other speaker is Dr. Fritz Breithaupt, who's a provost professor of Germanic Studies and Cognitive Science, and also in comparative literature and cultural studies. He publishes widely on empathy, narrative cognition, and German intellectual history. Uh, Perhaps very germane to the present discussion, he has a book from 2019 called The Dark Sides of Empathy. It was covered in NPR and other outlets. Also a book that came out in English last year called The Narrative Brain. That book was the number one nonfiction book in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland in August 2022. Um, and in that work, he focuses on how to think about narratives and mini stories and episodes that we can use to engage our empathetic emotions and connect us with others. He directs the Experimental Humanities Laboratory. Um, I would love to learn more about what you do there. That sounds fascinating. I worked with experimental philosophers in the past, and so I'm kind of curious what your angle is with experimental humanities. Um, and I thought it was interesting to see he recently conducted the largest serial reproduction of narrative studies to date, with stories and over 12,000 people. And so it sounds like trying to connect how we use narratives with our social interactions and emotions. And he's received many honors and awards, the Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship, and major grants, including from the John Templeton Foundation as well. So I'm excited to see how these two play off each other. They're both from Indiana, so perhaps you've chatted in the past, but I'm curious to see your different perspectives on empathy and its use. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sara Konrath.
Thanks for introducing us, and I'm super excited to be here. Thank you for all of you who are joining us either live or on video. Um, Fritz is a dear colleague and friend, so it's really fun to do this. I get to be the good cop for empathy. I'm very excited. But I think that together we really portray a balanced portrait of both the benefits and the potential harms of empathy. So I'm going to focus my presentation on the benefits, and he will describe some potential dark sides of empathy. My take on this is I call it harnessing the power of empathy, because I think because like anything, it has a shadow. So trying to work with empathy carefully and thoughtfully, so that we can maximize benefits of it, I think is where I come from, while acknowledging that nothing is perfect and everything has complexity. So we start with definitions. I think this is really important, and this is where we often get tripped up when it comes to what are the potential benefits or harms for empathy. There are many, many definitions. I'm sure people in the audience are thinking of what they think empathy is. It's such a broad term that I almost wish we didn't use it. Fritz and I have been working on a project where we're suggesting that people don't use the broad term too often, but instead use more specific definitions when they're talking about empathy. But here are the definitions I'm going to work with. So when I'm talking about empathy in this talk, it's going to be based on either cognitive empathy, which can include different ways of trying to understand other people's perspectives, or one type of emotional empathy, which involves feeling compassion, which we call empathic concern, but I'll use the word compassion interchangeably. And for these two core types of empathy I focus on, you can kind of have, like, if you think about it, like empathy with your head, like being a detective, really using your effort and trying to figure out what's going on. But also empathy with your heart, just wanting to be present and available for people when they need you. And ideally, these should go together. It works best when they go together. And there are some times if you have one and not the other, it can be problematic. But in practice, in everyday people, people tend to score high in both of these together. The important point is that both of these are focused on other people, whether you care for them or you're trying to understand them. So there's an other orientation here, an other focus. And I think that matters. So we can easily think about what low empathy people are like. Our stereotypes, we think, oh, narcissism, like they're mean, they don't care about others, they're selfish. But a lot of us who try to be caring, who are well-meaning and try to practice empathy, sometimes miss the mark in terms of having an other-focused type of empathy. As an example of this, emotion contagion is when we feel what others are feeling. And some see this as empathy. That's one of the ways people define it. And it's definitely a beginning. Babies and animals tend to feel this kind of empathy. And I think it's good as a foundation or as a kind of a flicker when you are interacting with others. But if all we're doing is feeling other people's feelings, it may not be beneficial for ourselves and others. For example, imagine if your best friend loses her job and feels depressed. Now, if you understand her sadness and you're there to support her, that's helpful. But if you feel exactly what she's feeling, you could get stuck in negativity. You could get overwhelmed and not be able to be available. Another example is personal distress, which involves when you feel upset for yourself when something bad happens to someone else. There's many examples of this. It's also kind of often, it's just a negative, overwhelmed feeling. But with this example of your friend losing her job, you might then suddenly start to worry that your job is at risk. And then you'll start to feel anxious and be sort of more self-focused and worried about yourself, which might then interrupt your tendency to actually be there and available for your friend in that moment. So these are just kind of like, some people call these the part of the empathy universe in terms of definitions, but this is not what, when I'm talking about the benefits of empathy, I'm not talking about these things. This is a very tricky one, the next one, because haven't we all heard like empathy is just putting yourself in someone else's shoes? Like that's the most common definition that I hear. And yet we have to be careful with what we're doing there because there's a difference between trying to imagine someone's perspective from what it's like for them, from their perspective, versus you thinking about how you would react if you were in that situation. You can imagine that if you've overcome a challenge, and then you see that another person is struggling and not doing well overcoming it, you might be like, well, when I experienced that, like I was fine. Like I don't understand why this person can't deal with it. And that's not empathy, right? It can actually interrupt your empathy. But sometimes having a little sense of your own self can also be helpful. So it's like it's complicated. I think the overall picture of today's talk is that it's going to be complicated, but sometimes it helps that we've had some experiences and we can at least have a flicker of understanding from those experiences. But I think not projecting ourselves into someone else's experience, but just sitting with them and letting them guide us as to how they're feeling and doing would be more empathetic. And then sympathy is a complicated word because sometimes people use it to mean compassion, but I'm using it to mean more like pity. So just kind of looking down on somebody and feeling a bit sorry for them. But the way I define other-oriented empathy, it's about recognizing our common humanity and caring. For example, with nonprofits, um, they might express like sympathy or pity. They're describing the poor, hungry children that they serve. But I think they would be better at demonstrating a broader form of empathy if they invite people to imagine how a mother might feel when she can't feed her child or how a parent might feel, a more universal human experience, which could help to increase compassion. So this is subtle, but I think a lot of us see this as part of what empathy is, but I think there's a way to make empathy more sustainable and healthy and good for ourselves and others. And focusing on the other oriented types in terms of our development could be helpful. So here are some ways that we may not be quite empathic, even if we have good intentions and we're trying to be. And I'm going to invite you to just see if you can find your own pattern here. And I will tell you mine, although I'm sure I have more than one, but there's one I lean to. So one of these things is silver lining it. So a person comes to you, they say there's something going on, they're upset about something. And a silver lining response is like trying to reassure, cheer up, downplay, minimize, or make people feel better or feel differently. So when someone says, hey, look on the bright side. Oh, well, this probably happened for a good reason. Oh, don't let it get to you. Oh, don't cry. Don't worry. There's nothing to be upset at, and so on. Right? It's not the end of the world. Like these are all these ways. I think we really care. We're trying to like reassure a person, but oftentimes like that person doesn't feel that way, and it feels invalidating when we try to do this. Another one is being a fixer-upper, and I admit I struggle with this one, where someone comes to you with an issue and you're just like, okay, like let's figure this out, let's figure out like what we can do to make it better, like and so on, offering solutions, advice. You know, I've kind of learned as I've grown up a little bit that the only time to ever give advice is when someone like actually asks for it, and even then, maybe they're not asking, maybe they're just asking for reassurance or care. There's also interrogating, where we probe and analyze and evaluate, and we're asking like, oh, okay, what are you going to do about it? Why did you do that? I think you're reacting like this because of this. And again, these are well-intentioned. People are really trying to help here, but what they're doing is kind of like pushing a little too hard. And that often you can tell, if empathy is working right based on how people respond to your attempts at it. So it's always this like ongoing process where you kind of just make changes as you go to see what's actually helping people. And then there's discounting. Some people discount people's feelings. They disagree or blame or criticize, like you're being oversensitive. You should have known better. Well, it wouldn't have happened if you would have done this. These are all well-meaning things we hear when we're going through difficulty. And then, Here's another common one, which is stealing the thunder, where we move the focus to ourselves. So someone has gone through something, and then we say, well, now you know how I felt when I went through that thing. And again, there's context here. So sometimes it feels really good for the person who's going through something to know they're not alone. But still, I think taking over, stealing the thunder is when we kind of take over when they were sharing something and we kind of make it all about us instead. So these are just both sides, like the slide before this one and this one, just show kind of how empathy in practice often is difficult to get right. And you can think about which one you might do. And it's okay to notice these things. I mean, that's how we learn and grow. Empathy is something we can build in ourselves and in others. But, I can't just leave you with all the ways we miss it. We miss the mark. And so here is what it looks like when we're getting it right. And so I call this a lantern approach to empathy, which includes both perspective taking and compassionate responses. So this includes like listening, where we are actively paying attention to the speaker, what they're saying, what's underlying their message, what they're not saying, their tone of voice. Asking, where it's not interrogating, because you're following the other person's lead. When they say something, you're just asking a little more, like to clarify or to better understand. The purpose of asking is to understand and make sure you really truly understand where they're at. And then noticing, being tuned into subtle cues and nuances in their behavior, like energy levels, facial expressions, posture, body language, and so on. So it's like a close observation. Tuning in then. So you're using kind of your senses, and then you're kind of trying to emotionally connect with the person to try to really understand emotionally what they're going through. And then responding and nurturing. So responding is when you react in a way that shows non-judgmental understanding and compassion, like you're validating feelings, offering support, or just acknowledging that what they're going through is difficult. This can be shown by giving people the feeling that you're fully with them. For example, by sharing eye contact, leaning in, body language, affirming words and sounds. And then nurturing is that actual active process of providing support and encouragement and caring for any needs with the goal of types of connection. And so as you can see from this list of sort of descriptors of what empathy actually looks like, it requires a deep sense of focus and often on a single person at a time. And it can take, as Daryl's research finds, it can take time and effort. And this is when it's done very, very well. But even when we're attempting less, just shorter attempts at empathy, it still takes time and effort. When we think about empathy, we often think about the ways that it's good for others. And here I'm going to focus on research that is based on compassion or perspective taking, so those other-oriented forms of empathy. And decades of research and hundreds of studies find that empathy helps to inspire people to help others, share with them, and avoid harming them. Research finds that the number one reason that people give their money and time is because they care or feel compassion for others in need. Empathy motivates people to see a common humanity in others who might at first seem different from them. And when we imagine other people's perspectives, this can help increase compassion and also the desire to help, even in groups who are typically stigmatized in society. Research finds that more empathic teachers can nurture higher motivation and effort in students, and as a result, their students do better in school. This isn't just because more empathetic teachers are better or like easier graders. It's not just that everyone's getting an A. Students are also doing better on more objective outcomes like multiple choice tests. And one study found that after middle school teachers had a brief online training in how to be more empathic in their discipline strategies, compared to a control group where they learned how to use technology in the classroom, that later on, there was a decrease of suspension rates by 50% in their classrooms. So I think that what's going on here is that teachers are making different attributions for their students' behaviors and are trying to be more understanding. I believe that online training was something like 45 minutes, so it's pretty remarkable. As for therapists, more empathic therapists are associated with better mental health outcomes for their clients. And we also see this with physicians, that more empathic doctors have patients with better health outcomes. And this might have to do a little bit with trust, being more willing to listen to a doctor who you feel has heard you and really understands you, and then following their advice and listening to the health behaviors that, like taking medicine and so on. So I just shared a lot of different potential positive outcomes for others, that are related to empathy. And I really believe that in a world where we couldn't feel compassion for others or imagine their perspectives, it would actually not be a good world. So I do think that empathy is something we should nurture. Other-oriented empathy is also good for our relationships. Empathy is sometimes described as the glue of social relationships. And, empathic people, if you think about people who are empathetic, they're likable, they're fun to spend time with, it feels good. And the number one trait that both men and women are looking for in their romantic partners is kindness, which, I'd say that captures some of empathy. Research also finds that higher empathy people have higher quality relationships with friends, family members, including their children, and romantic partners. Empathic people also experience a number of personal benefits, which I think surprises people sometimes, that it can be good for empathic people themselves. For example, empathy predicts longer-term success in children. There was a longitudinal study that followed children over time and found that children who were rated by teachers as more empathic and helpful when they were in kindergarten were more successful 20 years later. For example, they are more likely to earn a college degree and also more likely to have a full-time job. Empathy also has surprising psychological and physical health benefits. Empathic people have a good quality of life. They are happier, have more meaning, and are less depressed. Again, other-oriented empathy specifically. My research explores health implications of empathy and giving behavior, and we have found, for example, that more empathic people have fewer stress hormones when they're experiencing a stressful event that we actually create in the lab, which is giving a speech, which I'm aware very much that I'm doing the same thing right now, that I'm giving a speech. But luckily, this research does work. There's other work showing that even when you just stop and shift your mindset to focus on others, you can have this effect, this stress regulating effect, in any circumstance. So I think that's pretty powerful evidence to see that it's affecting our physiology. And I have a forthcoming meta-analysis that examines the relationship between empathy and burnout. And I think people have probably mixed ideas of what the relationship might be. Is empathy associated with more burnout or less burnout? And what we find is that it depends on the type of empathy. So the other-oriented forms, perspective taking and empathic concern, are associated with a lower risk of burnout, but the more kind of self or merging forms, emotion contagion and personal distress, are actually associated with a higher risk of burnout. So does this mean that caring people could live longer? Well, my research actually finds that older adults who see themselves as kind and caring, they didn't have a measure of empathy, but they did have a self-assessment of whether they're kind and caring, that those older adults live longer than those who don't. We also find, of course, that giving time to others in any form, such as helping or volunteering, is associated with a lower risk of dying. So overall, other-oriented empathy is good for others, our relationships, and even ourselves. I'll next share some research that Fritz and I have done, in which we track changes over time in empathy among young Americans. And I want to start by saying it's really easy to feel smug about kids these days. This is very common. Like it always makes the headlines, stereotypes about young people. And in this comic, I just imagine like cave elders are shaking their heads and they're just thinking about how the young folks keep rubbing sticks together quickly instead of collecting the berries. Like, why are they so focused on those sparks? It doesn't make sense. They're always looking at them. But it's just meant to be a little humorous. Here's a quote from, I'm not going to say when, but I'll read it. And you can text in and say what year you think it's from, and Daryl can read some of them out. So the quote is, "Men will dishonor their parents, chiding them with bitter words. Hard-hearted, they will not repay their aged parents the cost of their nurture." In other words, kids today are selfish. So when do you think this is from?
Please do just drop it in the chat.
I'm always curious to hear people's thoughts here. And just shout them out if you see them. I can't see the chat right now.
So one person says 1920.
Okay, that's a good guess. Go before then. Anyone else want to venture something before then?
Ooh, interesting. So we
Well,
got uh my one student says 1873.
okay, well, it's even earlier than that. So this is something humans have, we've said this stuff about the kids, but there is a difference between what adults are saying about young people from the outside versus what young people are saying from their own perspective, their own self-reports, and behave of traits and behaviors. And so what we're doing is looking at young people's own reports, and therefore we can avoid kind of just looking down on young people, and we can just report what they're saying about themselves. What we do is we track surveys of large samples of American young people over time, and we compare them. We hold age constant. So, say this is a 20-year-old here in the 60s and in the 70s, also a 20-year-old in the 80s. So we're looking at the same age group, but across time. And by doing that, we can actually get a picture of generational change. So what we have found in the past is that narcissism increased from 1980 to 2006 in American college students, and empathy declined around the same time, up to about 2008 and 2009 in American college students. So that was what we had found in the past. You can see that here for the narcissism, but since basically the Great Recession, we've actually seen a decrease. So that means that the current generation of American college students are less narcissistic compared to what was happening before them. And we can see the same pattern with empathy, that there was a decline over time in college students' empathy. And then when we have updated this, when Fritz and I updated it, we find that there have been increases over time. Now, we will continue to update these results. This was recently published, but this research takes time. We also found this in large samples of high school students too, so it's not just college students.
Sarah, do you mean to share slides about this? Because I think currently we are just in person view. Do you want to show the graph about it?
Oh, it says, hang on. Okay, I didn't realize that because it said I was sharing, but I can reshare maybe. So
I was able to see the graph. Um,
well, I'll just share this. I'll just share that last slide and then we can continue. It's easy to find online too, if you're curious. Am I sharing just that slide?
yes, what I'm seeing is the slide showing up the changes up through 2018.
Okay, that's in high school students. I've been talking a lot, but we are now going to wrap up this last part of the presentation with some empathy building practices. So this is different than what does empathy look like? This is how do you actually get empathy? How do you build and grow empathy? So there are some genetic components to empathy. Some people are born with a little more, I don't know, maybe it's easier for them, or maybe they have more sensitivity or something. But all of us can grow it regardless of where we start. I see empathy like a muscle. Like some of us are born with a little more natural athletic tendency, but all of us have muscles that can be strengthened with practice. And that the muscle metaphor I think works well because when we're fatigued, it's harder to exercise, and same with empathy and so on. So I really think of it as something that is teachable and learnable. So a good place to start is with yourself. I think we don't often think about this when we're thinking about empathy interventions, but we need to be in a good place to be able to actually practice empathy. And so one thing we can do is practice self-compassion. When you include yourself in your circle of compassion, it's not just outward, but it's really like you're part of who deserves care. It could be easier to give to others. For example, it's difficult for people to empathize if they're tired or hungry or angry or stressed. And these temporary states are pretty overpowering and they get in the way of focusing on others' needs. So in that case, maybe you will be in need of empathy, or at least in need of some space or time to acknowledge what's going on with you. Self-regulation and self-awareness and self-regulation is also important. For example, we should be aware of our own personal triggers that shut down our empathy response. Like as an example of this, some people really admire self-sufficiency and independence, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing. And they find it difficult to empathize with people who appear to be helpless or needy. And other people can't tolerate aggressive or insubordinate or inappropriate behaviors. But it's helpful to try to understand the root causes of these behaviors. But knowing what kind of gets under your skin can help you move past your preferences and show people kindness and understanding. And not everyone has self-awareness or high self-awareness, but just like empathy, this can be learned, for example, through mindfulness practices or through therapy. And there's probably other ways that people develop it over time. Another idea is to seek connection, not perfection. I think that empathy is a moral trait, right? So there's a tendency to want to be a good person, and that's the motivation for trying to build empathy. But in reality, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to miss the mark. Sometimes we're not going to feel motivated, and that's okay. It's good to just think about developing empathy as like a lifelong practice, and be humble and willing to grow and willing to apologize when you make mistakes and focus on improving connections rather than being a good person. And then we should be willing to try to receive empathy from others. Now, there are some rules where we're more likely to share empathy in one direction, like maybe a therapist or a parent of an infant. But empathy is relational in nature. And a supportive, caring interactions, like when we have those, they're two-way streets, ideally. So others are also not going to be perfect in their expressions of empathy. So it's important to give each other grace. And that's just kind of the starting point of here's things to work on first. And then the way I see building empathy practices, there are so many practices supported by a lot of research. And here's a list. I can review them in a second, but just a context here that I'll say is find things you actually enjoy doing and love. That's going to make it reinforcing, and you're going to want to keep practicing and developing. One thing you can do is practice active listening, and using that lantern model could be helpful. And looking for similarities between yourself and others, especially those who are different. I think that can be a challenge sometimes, especially in a polarized world where we really see people as almost beyond our empathy. But if we stop for a moment and think about ways they share common humanity with us, that could be helpful. Also, spending time getting to know people. The contact hypothesis tells us that when we're actually spending time and often with a common goal, that we will feel more empathy for people. The arts is one way I love developing my own empathy. For example, research finds that reading fiction or taking acting classes, so here the theater, can be helpful in developing our empathy. And hello, this is my cat. Well, okay, I don't know if you see her, but I'll skip one because she just wanted to be seen. One way to build empathy is to interact with babies or animals because they can't use words to communicate. So this can help build your cognitive empathy to figure out what they want. What she wants right now is attention. And then animals and babies also activate nurturing and compassionate feelings. And I'm going to go back up to this one, imagining another person's feelings. This is a very, very well-studied way of building empathy that can take just a couple of seconds. You can do it with people who are alive or not alive, with fictional characters. You can really stretch your imagination here. And then practicing loving kindness meditation, where you start with wishing yourself well, and you expand outward to include all kinds of people, from your loved ones to people you're not getting along with, and to people all over the world. And then the final idea would be to surround yourself with highly empathic role models. So if you stop for a minute and you think, who is the most empathetic person you know? And hello. And so if you think about that person and you think about how can you learn from them and how can you spend time with them, because chances are that person has spent a lot of time developing their empathy and you can learn from their expertise. Thanks for your attention. You can read more about my research on my website, and you can also measure your own empathy levels at the website or QR code at the bottom of the screen. I've shared definitions of empathy, described ways that people can miss the mark, and ways to show it genuinely. I summarize research on benefits of other-oriented empathy for prosocial behavior, relationships, and also for empathic individuals. And I then reviewed empathy trends in American youth and some practices that can help to support and build empathy. Although on balance, I see other-oriented forms of empathy as mostly beneficial, and I think we need more of it, not less. There are still some potential dark sides and abuses of empathy that Fritz will now share. And
Fabulous.
Great.
really
Fabulous.
just
I
came
mean,
up right at that time. She really just good timing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as a cat owner, cats are they are wonderful creatures, and I love having them on expanding empathy. I think it's the first cat. I've my daughter made an appearance several years ago. I don't think my cat made an appearance, but yeah, it's always good to have. Um, there are a couple of quick questions. If we wanted to, before we hand it over to Fritz, maybe just handle a couple of questions from the audience. If Fritz, if you had any initial questions for Sarah, we could also save some of them for the panel afterwards too. Um, so there were two anonymous questions. One person asked, in general, and I'm not sure if this is about just static states of cognitive and emotional empathy, or also the changes you were talking about, which are wonderful to see that as you've updated things. And, this person wanted to know about the role of gender and cognitive and emotional empathy, and do you see differences? But are differences there, and if so, are they accurate?
Such a great question. I like that there's a are they accurate part to it. So like on the self-report types of measures that I was showing, and that people could take that scale for themselves. Yes, any self-report measure I've seen of empathy finds gender differences. Women score higher than men, girls score higher than boys. But I'm skeptical of those results because they tend to be, we're socialized very differently from the very beginning, with a lot of pressure and socialization on women to be sort of the pinnacles of empathy. And then men, if sometimes when men are showing empathy, they're almost like penalized for it. In the socialization practices, it depends on culture, of course, too. Um, so you would expect that if we're socialized that way, we're going to find differences. However, there's some research that kind of shows that maybe the research is or the differences are not really as deep as they could be. For example, when you look at people's video responses to something that like an empathy-inducing situation, they're having similar facial responses to those types of videos. And also when you kind of incentivize empathy, when scholars have incentivized empathy. And in those cases, gender differences disappear. So it suggests that there might be some motivation and socialization happening behind the scenes. And we shouldn't just assume that, there's only one of the sexes should be empathetic, but it's actually a human characteristic. All of us can do it. We all have the brain capacity to do it and to grow. And I wouldn't think of it as a gendered type of thing.
It's, the other question is, I think in terms of the challenges and the blockers and some of the scaffolds you were then talking about at the end. So this person asks, what are your thoughts on the approach of asking the other person what they would like from you when they are sharing a personal challenging situation? i.e., are you only looking to like asking something like, are you only looking to vent, or would you like to discuss possible solutions as well?
I think that's a great practice. I mean, of course, it depends on the context, but I think that sounds like the context is a trusting relationship. So you're just kind of checking in with somebody that you care about, and you're just saying, "What do you need right now?" And I think that's a good place to start because although we can try to take people's perspectives, we're sometimes not accurate at it. And this is called perspective mistaking, which is such great research. Look that up. But when we're not accurate, then we might think we're accurate. We're trying so hard, but we're not. Well, the best way to know what's really going on is just to ask what do you need? What's going on with you right now? How can I support you? And yeah, that might seem a little bit like there might be an expectation like we should somehow know or like read people's minds. But no, I don't think so. I think what really matters is how the person in need feels. And as long as they feel like they're being heard and that you're there for them, I think that's the most important thing.
Great. I do have a question that I think I'll save until after both talks about the challenges of empathizing and the scaffolds. I really liked what you had at the end about like the scaffolding for different kinds of empathetic engagement. And part of me wonders if there are situations, maybe some of the polarized contexts that Fritz will refer to, um, where some of the scaffolds work against each other, or there's
Mm.
not always role models, or there's competitions over what models of empathy or counter empathy are present in one's environment that I think is maybe interesting to think about. I might push that until after Fritz's talk, because I could imagine there might be some interesting like connections there. It builds off. We had a philosopher, Hannah Reid, give a talk at our political empathy and divisions conference last month, who talked about whether it's appropriate to empathize across group division when there's strong antagonism. And so I think I'll put a pin in that and come back to it. Because I do want to ask one quick question before we transition, which is about the changes you're seeing. So I remember when you visited in 2019, we talked a little bit after in the Q&A about like what do you think is explain some of the declines you were seeing, and you mentioned things about stress and burnout and motivations from a motivational perspective on empathy. Questions of how you perceive the costs of empathizing and generating compassion matter a lot, trading off against the benefits. And I'm just wondering, with the changes you're now seeing, where you're seeing the trait self-reports come back up,
Mhm.
do you think that is tracking any sort of attitudinal shift, or do you have anything in your data to speak to what do you think this says about the mechanisms that could explain the patterns that are changing over time?
Yeah, I mean, I was been doing this for a while and I update my beliefs based on what I see in the data. And so that was a pleasant surprise to see that empathy has been increasing. And because of the year, because of 2008, 2009, Fritz and I and our colleagues wondered if it might be the Great Recession or something about the economy. And so we ran some analyses to try to see if that was potentially explanatory. And to my surprise, it wasn't. I really thought it would be that. Really, when you see that both in narcissism and in empathy, what we did find, we found little signals in some relational changes, and they're kind of not what you'd expect. So at the same time as we're seeing a rise in empathy, we're also seeing a rise in loneliness among young people. Those are tracking with each other. And I think that that's interesting in a variety of ways. It's not what I would have expected necessarily, but to think that, well, if you see your colleagues, your friends, people around you at school are feeling lonely and they seem like they need support, maybe that's going to build your empathy in some way. Um, on the other hand, maybe loneliness is it's kind of like a social hunger, and it's just making you really feel like you want to reach out to others. You don't want to be alone, and you want to practice empathy, try to care for others around you because you feel like not very connected. So we don't really know. Like what we know is that there's some like signal showing up there, and we can only make up some stories about what might be going on and why. But I think it's pretty interesting in light of the loneliness, as people call it, the loneliness epidemic. But I think, there's a lot going on. I think it's not, people used to say it's social media. Even I thought it could be because of the timing of the decline, where in the past research, we found that it was really after the year 2000 that there was a big decline in empathy. But then now that we see the rise since 2008, I mean, I don't think social media is really obviously not a cause of a decline. I mean, I think social media is complicated and at times it supports people's empathy because they're actually like being exposed to more people than they would have otherwise, and a lot of signals of distress that they might not have seen.
Great. Well, we'll definitely get back to some of that in the discussion too, because I think social media and that makes me think of recent discussions. There was this interesting paper on morality in the Anthropocene and like constant exposure to stimuli in the world and suffering in the world, and could that actually compromise compassion? But let's it could be something else we put a pin in. Because yeah, I think that I agree. I think the social media interactions, like how we choose to use social media, the modality is so complex that it could afford a lot of both wise and unwise uses. That essentializing it is just bad. Is yeah, I agree with you. Um, Okay. There is one last question. Beth asked about interactions of the personality, like agreeableness. So why don't we take that's the last question for now, and then we'll pivot over to Fritz.
Well, agreeableness, I think there's like a subfacet that is really overlapped with empathy. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's capturing some of the variance. So agreeable is bigger than empathy, but there's a little bit of empathy in agreeableness is the way I see it. But I don't use the big five too much in my work. So some big five person is going to see this and just, I welcome your email.
All right, thank you. Thanks. So Fritz, whenever you're ready.
I'm always ready. It is a huge pleasure to follow Sarah. First of all, I mean, we have a world-renowned empathy researcher here, and I admire her work in all respects. So I always learn something from what she tells me, even things that we've talked about before, of course. So this is fantastic. What you will be hearing me is actually that I'm not trying to persuade you that empathy is bad. I actually would sign everything that Sarah has said. I wish everyone here who is watching or listening to this podcast here to say, well, I wish you a lot of positive empathy, other-oriented empathy, and empathy in general, all the different facets in your life. It has a lot of these benefits. So I agree in principle on most of those kind of things. So this will not be a hostile kind of debate of saying, no, she's all wrong, or her data are wrong, or her conclusions are wrong. Not at all, not at all. Um, but I do want to carve into it a little bit here and kind of giving you some food for thought. I want to kind of potentially come to some of these and come back to one or two of these things that Sarah said along the way. But I really want to do two other things to give you food for thought. And I won't offer you too many data, but I will have a couple of data along the way here as well. And of course, these are PowerPoint slides. I will share, and I tried to update it a little bit during Sarah's talk, so I have to find the proper page. I apologize for that. 1 second here. Okay, so I will focus on the dark sides of empathy here. Um, and what I want to do here is I want to do two things. And these are the two takeaways in a way for you already. The first thing I want you to think about empathy as a practice, as an embedded practice, not just like the on and off kind of thing or the brain mechanism that might be behind it, but the social context. And Sarah has already kind of included a lot of those kind of things. So I will talk about the triggers, but also the blockers of empathy. My point there will be that the blockers also have a positive function, a shammering function. But then I want to come to the dark sides of empathy. I will throw out a couple of them, hopefully to kind of inspire some thinking about it. Let me nevertheless rehash quickly the definitions here. And this is basically where I say I'm fully on board with Sarah. We share the same set of vocabulary here. I want to introduce 4 notions of empathy. The core idea here is that we indeed, as humans, have a lot of forms that people call empathy available to us, all of us. People use them slightly differently, cultures use them differently, and so on and so on. The first one of those is sometimes called altruism, sympathy, pity, something that motivates us to help others. Very powerful, very important. The second one is the one that Sarah introduced as one of her 2 core notions, the cognitive empathy, the understanding the emotions of others, perspective taking, those kind of mechanisms by which we understand what others are going through. The third one is then what we now call emotional congruence, by which we mean that we can share emotions of others. We are not just kind of intellectually relating to feelings of others, but we actually will have these emotions and not just completely passively like an emotional contagion, but they really move us. There's a fourth definition, and that hasn't come up explicitly by Sarah, although Sarah is very much aware of that, which is sometimes called transportation, sometimes it's called co-experience. And I want to stress that a little bit. I won't talk too much about it here, but I do think that's often a form of empathy that we can also practice. This is, if I would add anything to Sarah's talk, I probably would add that more on the potential things that people can practice is to really relate to others and go through their situations and their experiences. And of course, that involves then going through probably similar emotions in that process too. It involves better understanding and listening skills to see, okay, share that situation with me. It goes both ways. It can also mean that you make your own experiences available to others. And we do that by often by means of storytelling. Very powerful means of connecting people too. I just put that aside here, just to mention it briefly. So Sarah and Mark Davis have spearheaded a paper that connects also Daryl into our group here. So he's not innocent here as a bystander, he's involved too. I want to emphasize that where we kind of ultimately have 8 terms of empathy that we define and that are somewhat independent from each other. I just put it up here. If someone wants to go back to this show, they can go over it and so on. The paper hopefully will be out soon. And we hope to establish a united vocabulary to make it a little bit easier to talk about these matters. Sarah already mentioned these data here, so I just want to show you the data again as a riddle, because the real thing about this is there's a big riddle here. Sarah had found in her own earlier work that there was a huge decline of empathy up to 2008 or 9. But then in the update, the latest one that we published, and I was involved, I was allowed to be involved as kind of the person who might offer some more dark perspectives on it. But suddenly we had good news, empathy was going up. The real finding here is really that there's a lot of it is a riddle. We cannot fully understand why tendencies have gone up. I just mentioned it again here to emphasize that. I did like a lot what Sarah was just saying, that she suspects that the loneliness crisis today might have driven up this positive development, that more people suddenly see the need to reach out to other people. There is one data point that I want to show you, different research that I've done, that might actually go in that direction too, which is a study where we measured markers of depression in language. What we did is we looked at cognitive distortions in all published books that are available on Google, which is like 30% of all printed books. And we saw, and I won't explain this clearly here, we just saw that cognitive distortions, language that's related to depressions, is suddenly skyrocketing in the last couple of years. And so this combination of loneliness and some indirect forms of depression might indeed recommend empathy as a solution. We suddenly need that connection. We hope for something else here, and we see suffering. So our world is not as good as it could be. Far off from it, unfortunately. So this is food for thought. But here I want to come to my 2 promised models or food for thought ideas. The first thing that I want to talk about is what I call the trigger model of empathy. And the simple version of it, very briefly, is that even these different forms of empathy, they're not just always automatically on. Even we might have the ability for it, but it doesn't mean that we use that form of empathy. It can be triggered, but it can also be blocked. And I have a fairly schematic way of introducing that to you. It is really more like to help you understand how I conceptualize it. We'll explain that in fairly brief ways. Up front, I want to tell you then, and this will then also allow me as a segue into getting into the dark sides of empathy. There's basically a couple of things I want to challenge here. First thing is I want to challenge empathies between 2 people. The model is one person who has empathy and the other person, so on. I think there's sometimes we have to look at larger groups, sometimes 3 people in particular I want to look at. A common assumption is that empathy is good for conflict resolution. I want to challenge that too. There's another notion that empathy is good for the empathizee. I'm not so convinced about that. It can be. I actually will suggest that in many cases, empathy is better for the empathizer, one who reaches out to other people. And then, of course, the ultimate one is empathy is always good. That's where you'll see I will try to mark into that. So, but let me come to the trigger model abstract here too. And I will do this in a fairly straightforward way. The key thing is to see what leads people to use empathy or to block it in some cases. And I think already this list of all these different forms of empathy here that Sarah has introduced, that I've added to, and Daryl has published on as well, indicates that we have a lot of forms of empathy in this empathy universe. We are in a way hyper empathetic beings. We are the animal with empathy. In fact, some human biologists who study the evolution of mankind sometimes make that say that, okay, man is the animal with empathy. That develops, explains our large brain, our success, and all of that. All other aspects kind of are more secondary to that. Marcelo has made that argument. But once you're hyper empathetic, and there's a lot of people who make that argument here, including also some people like Philip Kanske also explains how many forms, was here on the show last week, who explains how many forms we have there, would say they all indicate, without using that word, that there's something like hyper empathy is possible for us. But there's a problem. And I want to call this problem here in a stark way, out in a stark way, which is we can extend ourselves too far. Nowadays in media, we are confronted with sad and horrible affairs, and we can't always empathize. That would lead to potentially exhaustion, maybe burnout. It can also lead to something in a more abstract form, into self-loss. So I have made the argument elsewhere that even Stockholm syndrome, where the victims of a hostage crisis kind of supported the hostage takers. You know, that could potentially be one of these misfiring of empathy, or firing in a radical, horrible situation. That's not the argument I want to repeat here, but I want to stress is empathy can also lead to something like self-loss. We lose ourselves and other people when it gets out of hand, when it's too unlimited. So we do need something like blocking mechanisms. We need to channel empathy consciously or less consciously in some automatic way. We won't always empathize for everyone in every situation. So in this simple architecture of the trigger models, I would say, well, okay, we have capacity for empathy. Every human being, everyone, has more than one form available to them. There's several parts of that. So that comes with being human. But because of that, we also need to, and we automatically learn to channel it, to partially block it, withhold it. We manage it in a sense. A fun, famous study, of course, was one classical study by Tanya Singer and others in 2006, where they examined differences between male and female brains. The scandal at that point was that neuroscientists wanted to establish that women have more empathy. And in a way, they failed to do so. All their studies always showed that male and female brains actually react fairly similar. I mean, react similarly. Maybe there's some differences in intensity, but it was fairly little. And Sarah just mentioned that the differences might not be so huge about male and female. But then there was one interesting study, the first one that established for neuroscientists a difference. It involved punishment of bad guys. They had, in the study, they had something where people could get an electroshock. People saw on the brain scanner, they saw a video of someone getting punished, pain. And the first person they showed was like someone who suffered for the wrong reason. So everyone felt empathy. The brains in this particular emotion sharing form of empathy were lighting up. Male and female, same thing. But then they punished the person who actually had done something wrong. People saw a video of someone suffering who had done bad things before. So the women, female participants in that study, they had reduced level of activation of that emotional sharing. They felt the pain, not so strongly. So they already blocked it partly. But here's where the difference came in. Then the males did not share the pain. they actually activated a completely different part of the brain that has usually nothing to do with empathy. Reward. They loved seeing the suffering of the bad person there who had cheated in some game before, which which is interesting for many reasons. It's also interesting for the male and female state. We just got a wonderful question about that from the audience here. But for my case here, why I want to use that as a symbol of one of many examples is to say, apparently, we do block empathy in some situations and regulate them. For example, if there's a wrongdoer there, we actually can withhold that emotion sharing. So this is not just something like that we automatically always have empathy. No, no, it's a very kind of learned social controlled behavior. We apparently have learned to block it. There's a whole list of these things. I will come to more of them here. So there's experiments that have studied that about how we withhold empathy for outgroup members, enemies, competitors, people who get a lot of money for suffering. Studies where, again, where you show someone suffering, but they suddenly get money. Oh, they reduce empathy there too. And so on and so on. There's a long list of places where that have been experimentally shown where empathy becomes reduced or blocked completely. Which now leads to the question, when do we actually have empathy? Sometimes we have the capacity, we're hyper empathetic. Two, we actually channel, we make selections. We don't always empathize in the same way. We're smart in that sense. They can do that consciously too. If there's an empath, a so-called empath, I don't use that notion, but a so-called empath among us here, well, you can actually consciously, apparently people can learn that to withhold empathy, which again shows there's a learning process. In many cases, it happens without us thinking about it. But then the question is, when do we actually still have empathy? What triggers it? And I want to show you, and this is a quick show of images here, some model of how we can imagine this. This does not correspond to parts in the brain, but there are studies behind it that show how this can work in some cases. So this is excuse me, this is not art. It's very simplistic, but what I show here, or want to communicate, is that you see on the lower level of the slides, you see the eye. That's the observer, the person who has empathy. And they have lots of forms of empathy. But then they themselves build up a blocking mechanism. They're a little bit careful not to always have empathy, to get exploited, to get seduced and manipulated by others. There's a person on the top level of the graph they have empathy with. And now the question is, so how do you sometimes have it? And one possibility what triggers empathy can be if you have a new stimulus. So I want to invite everyone who's listening here to observe themselves to see, well, what actually triggers my empathy? That can be in a movie. Movies are fantastic to study your own empathy, your reaction. Why do you like this character? How do you share their feelings, but not the other person? And we don't all agree. Hollywood is fantastic in other movies to kind of manage empathy for us. So one of these mechanisms here that allows it can be this, what I call the bypassing, some novelty. There's a stimulus that we haven't seen before. And then we are excited, we feel for it. We haven't built up a block for that. In some other cases, we are used to not have empathy if someone is suffering, let's say, but then it becomes just so powerful. The emotions of the other persons are so strong. It's more than we're used to. Then our wall breaks. It just breaks through. It's just the strength of the stimulus. Easy to imagine. Now, there's also what I call tunneling. It's the next kind of form of these things. Tunneling, I call a form of culturally accepted or sanctioned stimulus where most people in a culture would feel empathy for. So in our Western culture, and I assume that Daryl, Sarah, and I are all part of this American, in my case, European culture, where we typically tend to have a lot of attention for children. Children falling and crying is a typical stimulus for us. But there are other cultures where they say no. When a child cries, they deal with it differently. For them, that is a blocking mechanism. They say, oh, no, no, the kids want to manipulate you. Don't fall for that. But for us, it is a tunneled and accepted and expected form of empathy trigger. Now I want to give you a more odd one, which I call admission with a return. A strong trigger of empathy is for us when we see a situation where we know this is short. Empathy is needed, but when I'm done with it, I can return to myself quickly. It's not permanent, selfless. There's a return structure built in. Imagine the following thing. You see one picture of a person who is in the hospital. They're suffering. Same picture. Now, you give people two forms of instructions. One time to tell them, oh yeah, this person is suffering in the hospital. It's chronic pain. It's lots of pain. It will get worse and worse and worse. There's no end in sight, no healing. Other people get the same picture and they see, oh, this person is in acute pain. Very much pain, but it will be better in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that. And now the question comes to, how do people feel about that person? How likely are they to visit and all of these kind of things? And it's not black and white here, but there is some preference for the acute sufferer, depending a little bit on the conditions you set it up for. Not for everyone, of course, but the person who will get better gets more visitors. Of course, the chronic person also who has an illness. It's not that people block the person out, but there's something about it that's more, we are more willing to devote, or many of us are more willing to devote time to someone where it's short because it comes to an end. Another example of that is, it's one from one of my experimental humanities sites, is storytelling, fiction, movies. They always come, and that's so important, with an end structure. At some point, we dive into the world of another person. We do have something like empathy or co-experiences with a fictional character. But narratives tend to come to an end. They move fast, and then at some point, there's an end structure in it. That is super attractive because we know we dive into the world of another person, but then we return back to ourselves. And this return structure, I think, functions as a promise that when we read fiction, when we hear a story, we already know there will be an endpoint. And that is then, after a while, once we have learned that's how stories work, there will be an endpoint. There is a happy kind of trigger for us that we say, oh yeah, my risk of having empathy is not so high. There's more forms here, and this one is the one that I will talk about later and soon in the dark sides of empathy a lot, which is side taking. And this is an interesting one. People are typically a little bit reserved to immediately have empathy with other people. But in the moment we observe a conflict or tension of two other people, we tend to very quickly choose a side. If two people have a conflict, it might be a couple at the bar, but it can also be two sport teams, of course, or other structured things in the media, a legal crisis, a political debate. That is highly attractive for us. And interestingly, in that situation, people look at these events by looking at taking a side quickly, then sharing that perspective of that side, seeing the world a little bit more like that person. And then they start to be lured into that perspective, or tend to be lured into it. I will give you a little bit of data a little bit later on, to also copy emotional values or the emotions they imagine that person to have. So side taking becomes an interesting trigger for us. We do like to take sides somehow. Okay, so there's more. I won't get into that. Love, very important, and so on. So the key takeaway here from this first part of my lecture is, yes, we have empathy, different forms of empathy available to us, but we don't always use them. They don't get always activated. Some get more activated in certain situations. There's things in the situation that leads us to use it. There's also things in ourselves. We can control it consciously in some cases. We can also unconsciously, we get swayed into it by many kind of contextual factors. For example, our group identity and so on and so on. And that's something that we can look at and we don't understand very well. So these triggers of empathy and the blockers of empathy are, I would say, relatively underinvestigated. I mean, of course, I'm saying that here to the people who don't under investigate. Both Sarah and Daryl have done amazing work in that area. But I will now move, and this will be quick. I want to give you more food for thought. I will throw some of the dark sides at you. Potential misfirings of empathy, different aspects of empathy. And some of that is now can follow fairly naturally from my model of these trigger and blockers. Note, by the way, that the blockers that I meant, I want to emphasize one more thing to emphasize. Sarah already mentioned some empathy blockers. What Sarah emphasized, they were in the situations that she was describing, they were kind of negative. They were things that would prevent you from people to feel empathy or feeling hurt because they're interrupting it. I want to make the point that some of these blockers are very, that sounds like bad, but healthy or natural and acceptable. It is absolutely right sometimes to distance yourself from other people. There are situations where you do not owe people empathy. You don't want to be exploited. Not every narcissist deserves your empathy. So the blocking part is also, in that sense, healthy, is an aspect of being a social being as we are. Okay, dark sides of empathy. First one, looking at the empathizer, and I've already introduced this one, is there can be self-loss. People can overextend themselves. They cannot, if they fail to have this return structure, that can be very exhausting. I mentioned Stockholm syndrome, very extreme case. I write more about that in my book, The Dark Sides of Empathy. I just want you to imagine that the original case of the banking holdup, and there's other cases where this happens. It's not very common, of course, but I use it more as an example for a fairly normal behavior. In that original bank holdup in Stockholm, Sweden, these 5 hostages were fighting on for the hostage takers even after they had been kind of overwhelmed by the police. And then one of them had a long-term romantic love relationship with one of the hostage takers, and so on and so on. There's something very radical that happened there. And I think that's not so uncommon in our cultural heritage. The traditional, like the 19th century family that's all focused on the male, where everyone else's life is less important, but the patriarch is leading it, where people lose themselves for that leader, male leader traditionally for us. There is an interesting phenomenon that has got a lot of attention. It's not as clear nowadays as it was, the data seemed to say like 5 years ago. Medical doctors can suffer from something that that it's not a technical term, empathy burnout, where they first come in with a very high emotional form of empathy, but then lose that in the years of their practice. There were a lot of findings that went in that direction. Lately, this has become a little bit more debated. It is possible that doctors are a little bit more aware of it now, or that it's not as clear. But at least there's a huge debate about that, the potential empathy loss of doctors who get burned out. They have extended themselves too much if they don't monitor themselves. Second dark side. I'll try to be fast here. I just mentioned one trigger of empathy, which is side taking. And indeed, I think one of the very powerful triggers of empathy is a quick take dynamic of side taking. When people even just see a picture, like this picture here of the man and the woman down here, most people tend to fairly quickly arrest their eyes more on the one side or the other side and see the situation suddenly from there. You can also look at that in movie scenes or in other ones. People quickly take one side. We also have quick judgment makers. We know that in 500ths of a second, we judge whether we like someone or not. We have some inkling about it, and so on and so on. And that's the dynamic that I think I want to describe here. Schematically, what I think happens is we observe a conflict as observer between two others, mentally quickly take a side. We see the situation from the one perspective or the other, then we adopt that perspective. We have a chosen side. And when we adopt that's point three, when we adopt that perspective, we suddenly see the other person through the eyes of our chosen side, and then suddenly the other side doesn't look so good any longer. They become more evil, more, in a way, less attractive, less well-meaning to us. We devaluate them. And we share the emotions of our chosen side to say they dislike that other person, which then means that we feel like, oh yeah, I picked the right side. My side is correct, morally right, and right in other effects too. And it leads to us reinforcing that side taking. Which means the point that I want to make here is that in social situations of three, not two people here, one observing a conflict of two other individuals or even groups, can lead to a stronger polarization, that we see these two parts as further apart. So empathy here becomes a mean of polarization. There's many cases for that. Sport is one of these more happy cases where that happens, where we watch sport, and sport is really boring until you choose a side. Even, I mean, I can do that in sports that I don't understand how they work, like baseball. I think it's this American sport with a stick and balls, and I don't understand it. But once I choose a side, it's actually quite enjoyable. There's a lot of cases for that. And it leads to this evilization of the one side and the beautification of the chosen side. Um, I could talk about political cases, large case studies. There was an interesting empathy experiment with the school system in Ireland. I'll skip that for time. There's also ways out of it, which I think in a lot of cases, I'm referring here to the truth and reconciliation method, which mostly doesn't involve empathy. People say we have to move on, but empathy is not the goal of this. It's actually held in check. And it might be a better way to get over certain conflicts, because empathy can just lead to further divide and further pain in the process. I want to give you one study that we published last year, where we looked at this effect, and I won't explain the details of it, but we noticed how quickly we had just narratives that we offered people that were balanced, and we noticed that once people choose a side very quickly from the very first beginning of the story, and it's a story that people read in segments, once they chose a side, they would only afterwards remember the details, even details like what was the color of their sweater, little details about them, so much better about their preferred side. Once they had kind of selected their side in the beginning of the story, they stopped paying attention to the other side. The other side then was kind of, they still knew some of their elements, but half of them, there was actually 50-50 whether they would remember them correctly or incorrectly. Right? For their chosen side, it was a very strong effect. So side taking fueled with empathy leads to kind of ignorance on the other side. And that, of course, then has other effects. Okay, I want to move fast here, so I throw three more at you, but these will be faster. So the third dark side of empathy I call false empathy, which is something that people often think is empathy, but I think it's a wrong hero identification instead of empathy. Sara will say that this is not it looks only to the outside like an other-oriented empathy. In reality, it's not. Here's what I have in mind. It's a typical situation of someone observing someone who is suffering and who is in need. Many people always tell me, okay, Fritz, I know you want to talk about the dark sides of empathy, but if someone is suffering, we help. That shows we're good, and empathy is good. I want to complicate this a little bit. So when we see someone who's suffering in need, sorry, this is a horrible picture. It actually still makes me cry. But I will come back to that picture in a second for a reason here. I think when we see a picture like that, it's a little bit more complicated. The first thing, well, we need to know that the person that is suffering is innocent. I mean, they didn't deserve their fate. It's like the wrongdoer. This earlier study, someone who did something bad, we don't feel for them so strongly. We need to have some innocence there. But we also need to imagine that there is a better future possible for them, that empathy in a way or pity makes a difference. They can come out of it. So some temporal component, that's fairly fine. But what I now claim is in a lot of cases, when we see someone in need, like look at this picture here. When I ask people, using this picture as an example, yeah, so on whom do you focus? Who are you in this picture? Many people will say, well, I'm the guy with the holding the drink to the kid that seems to have leprosy. Um, I see that picture from that perspective, and it makes sense. I mean, I think it's what at least whenever I do that survey, it's the majority of people. That's good. That person's helping too. It's a good person. Yeah. So obviously there's something interesting happening. It's a powerful picture on that level. But what I want to say here is that I wonder whether when we see people in need, we don't imagine always to be in the helper position, which means if we don't directly empathize in many cases, and not everyone, I'm generalizing a little bit too much here, but quite often we tend to see that scene from the scene of the helper. We imagine that we are this helper, and that's a little bit different. So here's the graphic again, and now I added this imaginary helper here. We focus on that helper in many cases and see the situation from the helper who can make a difference, bring about a better future, and so on and so on. So instead of having this true other focused empathy, it's a more self-focused helper identification. We imagine that we can be the one. And that's still not bad, but it makes a huge difference because now suddenly, as a helper, we have certain expectations. That leads us to good behavior. So what could be wrong with that? It's like they said, by the way, there's a lot of movies that follow that scheme. Schindler's List is the one of those examples where many people focus on that helper. Schindler himself, we focus on him and see this whole scenery through him and still imagine we could make a difference. In Germany, where I'm from, and I'm actually currently in Germany, we had an interesting moment in our history in September 2015, where our then Chancellor, Angela Merkel, decided to open the border for refugees. Refugees welcome. That was enormously powerful. There was the Syria war crisis. There were a lot of horrible things happening in Afghanistan and still in Iraq, also in Northern Africa. And Germany opens its borders, saying, no, we are a wealthy country. We can help. We can do that. So close to 1 million people came within 3 months to Germany. Germany did strengthen its muscle, found housing for them, did amazing positive things. And I really, I mean, it's very powerful. However, this is what happened. Within 4 months, the public was all bored, and then suddenly we had a backswing. Suddenly people thought, this is a party, it's called the Alternative for Germany. Um, I, we had this backswing where people were not happy. There were a lot of resentments after this very joyous positive things. 80%, close to 80% supported it. Suddenly we had a backswing to only 50% supported it, 50% were against it. My reading is the following. People identified as helpers. They didn't have empathy with these people in need so much. They wanted to be seen as the heroes. And then, of course, once you're the hero, you expect praise, recognition, or you expect you're suddenly the good person that everyone knows that. And well, the refugees, guess what? They were in horrible situations. They came out of a war zone. They had to lost family members. They were not the ones immediately to kind of applaud everyone in Germany and immediately learn German and become an immediately fantastic citizen, modern citizen. So they were dealing with trauma. And this praising and recognition of their purpose didn't happen, and that led to a backlash of resentment. Um, so I think there's an effect of fatigue when you don't have other focused empathy, but this more selfish side of it, that can have negative effects and it can backswing. There's still positive things in it because it can motivate action, but there's negative sides of resentment that are growing out of it. I want to be fast here because I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I want to, the others I will just mention with a single slide here. I have two other slides. The one I call vampiristic empathy. Um, and some of my ideas have been taken up by others, but the term vampiristic empathy didn't stick. So too bad. So far, can still come. I think there's a form of sucking out of the blood of other people when people want to vicariously live through others and participate in a better life, like living via others. It can be an actor, it can be a star, it can be the child that's in helicopter parents, where you have these parents in a way who have something like empathy for their kids, but they react by overprotecting them. They want their child to have a better childhood so that they can participate empathetically in that better life of their child. And that has a lot of negative effects. Yes, kids of helicopter parents do better in school, but then they suffer mentally from a lot of anxieties and they have a lot of fear of failure and so on and so on. So there is some negative dynamic here. Also, by the way, stalkers fit into that too, and so on and so on. Some can be harmless. A fan can also live vicariously, vampiristically. That's fine from a distance. But in some other cases, it's very negative. Fifth dark side, sadistic empathy. And what I mean here is not what used to be called, still is called in public knowledge, psychopathy. Or those kind of disorders. What I mean is something more like something everyday like behavior that people can feel, which means is that this tends to be probably people on the lower spectrum of emotional empathy. What I mean is that when people harm others, cause them pain or frustration, it can also just be making fun of someone in public, very common everyday occurrence for some. Then in that moment, when you make fun of someone else and embarrass them publicly, you know how they feel. They feel bad. You could then theoretically empathize with that. That's the dynamic that I want to describe here. Causing pain so that you can feel empathy with them. It's like empathy for empathy's sake. So, or the causing of pain so that then you can say, oh, I feel for you. I understand how you feel. I pity you. I feel it. So causing pain for co-experience, where empathy is involved, but it's the goal. The goal is not to help others, make them feel better, but no, you want to feel empathy, selfish empathy, by having them suffer. And yes, that is a self-focused form of empathy, but I think there are cases where this other focused empathy and self-focused empathy are not so easy to distinguish. I don't think people always understand that quite as clearly. I want to push back a little bit here for our discussion with Sarah here. Okay. Obviously, so I have a list of 5 negative forms. There's more, but I'll leave it with these 5 here. This is basically what I wanted to set out to say. I wanted to challenge that empathy is between two people. It often is, but this case of the side-taking dynamic, where one person takes a side between two others, involves the 3-person model of empathy. Research a three-person model of empathy. I think that's a powerful social addition to keep in mind. As I was hinting at, the empathy can lead to not always lead to conflict resolution. Empathy can also lead to further polarization. The sides become even more evilized or beautified sides, depending on your quick side taking. It's not always good for the empathizee. The helicopter kids example stands for that, but also several of the other ones. It tends to be good for the empathizer as long as they don't lose themselves. So ultimately, empathy is not always good. But should we be against empathy? Of course not. Empathy is essential. It's wonderful. It has so many good sides, but it's not flawless. And there are pitfalls in it. We need to learn it. We need to learn to manage it. And in addition to all the positive things that Sarah told us how we should deal with that, basically, how we can improve ourselves, so the empathy muscle, I think there's also a component here of self-observation, learning a little bit to see when we get triggered for empathy and when we block it. That self-understanding can play a role too, including in the emotional admissions of empathy. But this is where I will stop. And I thank you for your attention. And I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Fritz. That was a fascinating talk. There's so many so many questions I have about that. I love the focus on blockers and situational selection and management. That's an area that I've been fascinated with and focused on for a long time, and how we structure and yeah. So I guess we again, anyone in the audience who has any questions, just drop them in the Q&A, and I'll try to curate them. Um, I'll start us out with a couple. There is one here from Lauren, one of our former students here, who asks about this helper narrative that you mentioned at the end. Um, Thinking about how, I mean, you mentioned how it could maybe be used, it could be a function for political mobility and social collective action. She's connecting it to immigration in the US is an interesting case where both sides have identified different victims and helpers. This is a potentially interesting space when we had our politics conference last month, like where do people see those suffering in different people in different situations? And so Lauren is asking, how do you think people could better overcome identity ties that shape those helper narratives?
Mhm.
Um, Maybe using that a bit to try to empathize with those they may not view as victims. So I think what part of what she's asking is if we can allow that the helper identification can be a useful spark for empathy. When you have like a plurality of possible reference points within these polarized conflicts, like who is the real victim in these different conflicts? Is there a way, how I read the question, and Lauren, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, is how do you use that initial spark of the helper identity, but then maybe pivot it or make it more discerning or align it with something that achieves more of the common humanity that Sarah was speaking to in her talk?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of important strategies here. So when I talk to human aid professionals, they understand this dynamic and they deal with it in a very different way. They don't expect to be praised. They're often very cynical people and so on, but very motivated. It doesn't undermine them that they know, oh yeah, these people that I'm trying to help here as a professional now in a severe situation, um, um, they may not appreciate it whatsoever. And I'm not doing it for that appreciation. They just understand that they distance themselves from that dynamic. And so, but I will do good things for them. And that's what I'm here for. And people who have that motivation, they can sustain that. They identify as helpers, but not as these helpers to look for praise. The first thing is that that's a professional attitude. Now, but there's other people, of course, who are not professionals in that, and who kind of are in different situations. So in let's say the German situation, where you had suddenly the border being opened, um, and you had this huge influx of 5% of the population, basically, suddenly. 5%, is that quite cool? Not quite, but a huge, I mean, a huge jump of population actually coming into the country, so that everyone would see things in their neighborhood. The core thing there was to simply have interactions, get off from the big kind of picture of numbers and people or so. No, just two people. They were put in your neighborhood. Meet them, talk to them, find maybe common ground. The best thing always is when you talk to people, there's always things that people care for, and that goes beyond polarized groups, different groups. Be curious about them, learn about them. And then once you kind of know about that, that person is now an individual, and you talk and show and do both things, you come off that big horse of being the helper or something like that, or other forms too. So that's actually the real strategy, is to get out of the idea, oh yeah, these people are victims and so on. So I agree. I much like the direction of Lauren's question here. But there's different people may have different strategies that need to use for that to come into a long-term positive relationship.
So Two quick things that makes me think of. One, I mean, I like in your discussion with the medical case and the parenting case. I feel like often the talk of the trade-offs of empathy, when there is mention of dyadic cost and benefits, and often it is very unidirectional. It's like, what is the cost and benefit to the empathizer? But when there is exploration of the dyadic structure of it, and you consider both perspectives, I feel like often what you tend to see is actually a flip, or typically the discussion is like, well, what are the costs and benefits to the caregiver, with the assumption of positive benefits for the empathizee, the receiver. There's a paper on parenting, I think it was called The Cost of Empathy, from about 9 years ago, that looked at essentially parents who are higher on the same trait measure that Sarah mentioned. Their kids showed more positive, I think, stress or inflammation markers. But the parents themselves seem to be doing worse on on similar sorts of metrics. But I think flipping that perspective is rather interesting. Like, when do recipients of empathy actually prefer different kinds of engagement, and does it align, and how do those goal alignments play out? I think is quite fascinating. Um, well, one question.
Daryl, on that note, there's a study, or there's studies by Jackie Borer, who look at like what is it like for the person who is being empathized with in an intergroup context. So it's like white Canadians are asked to take the perspective of a partner they're going to talk to who's not white, and what does it feel like? And well, when the white person takes the perspective of their partner, they go, oh, this person maybe thinks I'm biased. And they start to get really awkward and uncomfortable. And they start to worry about being evaluated. And then the interaction doesn't go very well. And so the person who was supposed to be the recipient actually is like, what's going on with this person? Like, I feel uncomfortable. And it really is just the dynamic is really not positive. And that's an other oriented form of empathy, but it doesn't work well in that context.
It is a little bit like what happened in the school experiment in Northern Ireland, where school teachers developed a new approach. They thought, okay, there's the Protestant and the Catholics. They have been at war for centuries with each other, lots of atrocities. And they tried to kind of develop a new curriculum where they asked people to take the perspective of the other. So every kid, middle school, had to take the perspective of the Catholics or the Protestants. And it looked good. The kids passed the tests and so on. The teachers thought, okay, we're doing something right. But then they did follow-up studies carefully on the ground. And they noticed that these kids were more polarized than the generation before. And the reason that they've had for it was that they said, oh, we enforced in these kids that there's always two perspectives. There's a Catholic perspective and a Protestant one. In the end, they knew where they stood. They could tell about the suffering of the others, but they knew it's the others. And so they abandoned that project. And I hope they came up with something to say, oh, in the end, there's a lot of common history. The famine around 1900 on the potato bug and these kind of things. Everyone suffered, those kind of things. But that goes a little bit along this line, what the case that Sarah there presented.
Yeah, I think the one of the areas where you see limits is when you're talking about intergroup situations. Because at least my understanding of why empathy evolved is for caregiving of infants to keep babies alive, basically to nurture babies and keep them alive. And we all have the capacity. And then that's a very close personal, interpersonal situation. But then when you try to extrapolate it outside of like, just spending time with a person who you have a mutual kind of interdependent setting, you're in this setting where you influence each other's outcomes. Like it seems like in those settings, it seems maybe more likely to be beneficial, but I'm not sure. I was thinking as I was taking notes, and I was wondering if that was like a thread in some of the dark sides.
Mhm.
It's when because we're so hyper empathetic that we're empathizing with like all the time with groups, with non-humans. And
Yes,
when we
yes.
extend it sort of so widely, maybe we're seeing problems.
Mhm. I I would agree with that. That a lot of it is it's also even projections and the far distance empathy forms that are more susceptible to these dangers and the dark sides of empathy here. Of course, you can get into these small dynamics already within like couple of people where side-taking dynamics take over suddenly. So that can actually happen already in the family. And always the case of the helicopter parents. I mean, you could say to make the case that the helicopter parents is it's actually not when you just have the family unit, baby, parents, maybe siblings. It's actually in the moment that social pressure kicks in. They the parents suddenly see, oh, my precious kid is not doing fantastically well in school, or they're not completely popular, or there's something happening in sports, and they feel like they have to be part of it. So it might again be involved when you have a social situation you're coming in. So I guess that, yeah, that's your point. I agree to your point here.
I mean, the intergroup considerations are quite fascinating because I think they layer in these questions of cultural norms and attitudes that came up in Sarah's talk, but also there are so many like models for blockages too, and like highly contested norms that in real time contested over what the right blockages are. Um, Actually, I mean, we have some colleagues here at Penn State who are doing work on like empathy and interventions in Ireland and elsewhere and trying to think about how to teach about blockages. And I was thinking with, across your talks, and the question I was alluding to right after Sarah's, when you think about like normative scaffolds, like communities that support like models to look to for empathizing, and if, you see that the likely results of trying to empathize and extend an empathetic olive branch, so to speak, is this like either sadism in response or kind of a lack of reward of that empathetic attempt at connection. Um, Actually, forecasting to next week, Simone Chimay-Sori's her work on adaptive empathy and how we learn from the outcomes of our empathizing, whether it's rewarding or something to be continued, I think is really relevant here. But both seeing what like I like the three-person perspective, like seeing what others do and what's happening. I observe that if someone extends empathy to someone who is in conflict, they're punished and they're not, and then I learn from that. Or I go through that myself and have the same experience. That's I can see that being the source of a kind of one of the blockages you're talking about. Um, but then also the in-group norms, the idea that if my own group is telling me this is where you need to be channeling your empathy, and if you try to move it outside the in group, it's a problem. I can see all of those things creating the kinds of vectors that you're talking about that shape and contour where empathy is appropriate. And I think with your two talks, like how do you, it seems like that's something where the norms and the scaffolds and the models that we have that Sarah was talking about sometimes push against the attempts to otherwise act like draw upon empathetic impulses that might be activated. Because there might be some people who are hyper empathetic if the prominent models were a little bit different, but they are what they are, and they might be creating some of these blockages. So I'd just be curious to. I'm thinking about this in the context again of when Hannah Reed gave a talk last month about cross-partisan empathy. One of her points was that this could create this interesting sense of cognitive emotional injustice, where you're sort of being asked to empathize in a way that's risky, dangerous, might lead to, she didn't use the word self-loss, but could promote some of the same kind of moral confusion. Um, so it's a really interesting space, both from a psychological perspective, like what are the supplements we need, the supports we need, but I think from a normative humanities ethics perspective too, like what is appropriate to ask in these situations.
I
So I would,
think I always wonder when I hear when I even when I was hearing Fritz and also your question is like what kind of empathy? Because I think there's a difference between like trying to understand like cognitively what the person might believe or think or why they're doing something without agreeing with them. I mean, you can take you can imagine their perspective. It doesn't mean you endorse what they do or say. And so I think there's a huge difference between like that kind of empathy versus I don't even think endorsement is empathy, but I think specifying the type would help. But Fritz, what were you going to say?
No, I like that. I think but I would say that even on this more cognitive empathy, oops, I think my connection was somewhat. Can you still hear me? Okay. Okay. So even on this more perspective taking or cognitive side, if you are asked to do that, that being prompted to do that can set up an odd dynamic. I think the dynamic that Darrell was referring to here, that suddenly there is a pressure on it where you get outmaneuvered by others. Prompting in general is very interesting. There are some studies, and I haven't seen very large scale studies on it, but there have been a couple of studies with formerly called psychopaths who were actually prompted to feel the emotions of others. And usually, of course, we know they don't, and they can cause pain to others without feeling pain themselves. And that can make many of them dangerous in certain situations. But when they get prompted to feel the pain, their neuroscientists have said, no, their brain lights on. They're not empathy dead. They can do it. They just need that prompting, of course. So in that case, prompting seems to be a potential positive factor. But of course, we couldn't be assured that that's what will come. But I think so. From the many points that Darrell made here, also of course on the ethical and moral side, which I'll bracket for the second here, but maybe we'll come to it with the next question here. I think whoever is prompted or feels self-prompted to have empathy can also be in the weaker side of certain things. If you feel the emotions of someone else, you're more vulnerable because you feel like now, this is like in negotiations and you feel the feelings of the other side, you're weaker, you're more likely to be exploited. If you're prompted to take the perspective of someone else, on the one side, it's an intellectual exercise, but it's also still something that takes you out of your own perspective. And if you're don't have the trust that the other person's side is doing the same act, you may already, and correctly so, feel exploited, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think characterizing what the goals of the ask are, like what are the assumptions of the particular connection? I mean, I think I could see an argument for any of the three facets that you both mentioned, like cognitive perspective taking, emotion sharing, and compassion. I mean, even perspective taking, there's interesting work on explaining as condoning, to the degree that you try to explain why someone thinks that way, it could implicitly, either in the eyes of others, be seen as an, if you try to even take the perspective, it's allowing for the possibility that the perspective has some justifiable basis. And that could be seen as a implicit condoning. Um, but I feel like from an emotions sharing perspective, like the sense of contamination, like the idea that if I viscerally share in the experiences of someone who, wants to harm someone that I care about, is that something that somehow has like the discussed contamination sort of moral, something like Paul Rosin's work on this seems relevant. But then compassion, if with compassion and sympathy, if you're asking me to have compassion for someone who is callous towards like someone I care about. Like, is that, yeah, I mean, I guess I could see how depending on how you cash out each three, and then you could see it maybe, but then the reasons behind it too. And Jillian, what I believe is one of your students, asked about the context of teaching and fostering empathy and how do the methods matter. So how can we try to calibrate our methods? And I think this builds upon some of these threads to cultivate empathy for the out group on any of those three components, if we specify further, versus solidifying it for the in group. And I'm thinking of in Josh Green in his book Moral Tribes nicely frames the idea that these mechanisms could be so good at solidifying kind of the me versus us, like within group coordination. But when it comes to the between group effects, the very things that work so well for the in group might actually potentiate these disagreements. So how do we bridge those divides, do you think?
I mean,
I think contact. I mean, that seems pretty powerful. Just not just exposure, like being in the same school, but having shared goals and having equal status at the same time, working together on problems so that you can just get used to that other person as a human being. even if they're different on whatever the category is that you are struggling with. But that does seem to work. I think that I think we learn empathy, regulation of empathy, best through experiences. So like hearing like lectures like this or conversations like this are interesting at intellectual food, but I think we learn empathy by, you know, like watching a movie or interacting with people and kind of exploring our own reactions to what happened, why we felt that way, and asking questions like you just asked about, well, should I really feel compassion for somebody who wants to harm my child? Like, I think it's more practical than theoretical.
I, same, I agree. Um, Building common ground, having direct contact, sometimes give people a task, something where people suddenly have to cooperate and they don't notice that they're doing it. And then suddenly thereby they build up a common, they have a shared experience, um, where they accomplish something and then suddenly have even a common history they can refer to. So it's not just that they find commonality, they make that along the way if they have a common task. That's I think Sarah and I agree on this 100% here. That's a very good way of getting over this group divide. But I follow it up here with a question for the other two. Um, and Sarah was just alluding to that. So if you have someone who is doing something morally wrong, let's say hey, there's someone who wants to harm your child. Both Sarah and I have children. Um, um, that is horrible. And there's other wrongdoers of all kinds. So when should we use empathy, cognitive empathy to understand these wrongdoers? When do we owe people that we feel like, and sometimes of course this is fussy ground, we feel like they're dangerous to our kids. When should we use empathy, emotional empathy for their situation or cognitive empathy to understand where they're coming from? And when is it also to say, so no, I do not owe these people any empathy. I can block it. Where would you draw that line? And is in this kind of sense of, do I ever owe other people empathy? Or what form of empathy? Or is it also fine not to have any of that? What is your answer to that question? And that's a question actually I want to involve Daryl here too. He has done a lot of work on morality in that case here too. So it's for both of you.
Well, one thing I like about your side-taking approach, it reminds me a little bit of some of the work by Deschioli and Kurzban on morality as side-taking, and the idea that we use observable third-party signals to help calibrate each other's morality. You know, we all agree that like a stop sign or a stoplight regulates interpersonal behavior even in the face of conflicting goals. And so if part of what's happening with how we set up blocks for empathy is part of that. And it's a negotiation. Like, I mean, we see this with the discussions about whether we should have compassion across the world or just locally, whether empathy is weakness or strength. I mean, I think there's various ways we see this happening. Like, are strategic attempts to block considered normatively appropriate, and are we negotiate? How do we negotiate the signals that we use to regulate each other? Um, I think there's from a psychological level of analysis, I think it is really interesting to observe like the role of social norms and like whether certain kinds of like visible figures try to help calibrate those discussions. We know that people are very sensitive to like prominent, you know, celebrities. You mentioned parasocial contact earlier or alluded to it. Um, I think for me, psychologically, it's fascinating to consider how people try to shape the norms that regulate the blockages, basically.
Mhm.
But then ethically, whether it's appropriate. Um, I guess I would say if if we accept that psychological reality, then I think it does become more beholden to us to try to accept a responsibility to enter into those conversations to help. Like, if we think that blockages are what are considered appropriate blockages are created through collective conversation, then I think it's important to opt into those conversations, basically.
Mhm.
My take.
Okay. Interesting. So can I also ask Sarah to jump into this one? Do you you imagine as someone who wants to harm your children? Do you use empathy to understand cognitive,
Well,
emotional
Daryl was
empathy?
able to kind of sidestep
That's that's why I'm
responding
giving
directly to that.
that's
But
why
I
I'm
would,
giving you the difficult question. Sorry,
yeah, it is a
but I
difficult
like
question,
Darren's answer.
but it's like it's a difficult question, but we're also, I don't think it's an intellectual question. I think it's, a parent, a loving parent has empathy for their child, right? It's all encompassing, and they want to protect and care for their child. And so it's like almost like reflexive, or not, doesn't feel intellectual at all. It feels maybe not even empathy to want to protect your own child.
Yeah,
And so I think we can in a moment, I think I would respond like with passion without thinking, of course. I think we can, though, modulate our responses. We can think about them. We can try to, I think part of why I talked about empathy in different practices is because I do believe that, just like the muscle, that we can develop our skill set so that we're able to do things that are very challenging, um, and go beyond what the kind of reflex might be typically for our empathy, which is just for our own child or our in-group. And we can actually expand and develop more complex types of empathy, and more difficult and painful maybe sometimes, and maybe ones that our people around us don't really condone. But
yeah.
I think that someone's got to start. We all have to start figuring out how to create a more peaceful society. We're in the middle of really difficult times right now, and I don't think empathy is the only thing, the only way to make them better. But I think, like, being able to at least stop for a moment and reflect that the people around us are not our enemies could be a beginning.
Yeah, and just to follow up, I realized I did sort of like not fully engage the question. I went more,
I was just bugging you.
yeah. No, I mean, I think there's a place where empathy makes sense to gatekeep and to stop. I mean, I think that there are, and I think for me, like balancing empathy with something like moral outrage and figuring out empathy is acceptable to a point, but then at a certain point, when there are conditions, when the conditions and the scaffolds and the situational possibilities for empathy break down to a sufficient extent, I think and I think people are actively trying to navigate this on a practical level. Like, when is it okay to say, like, yeah, this doesn't deserve empathy anymore? And I think that's a really interesting, I mean, across both of your talks, and I was trying to think about, when you mentioned the blockers, Fritz, like, are these features of this? In some cases, it seems like they're like features of the stimuli. Like certain kinds of stimuli seem to make it easier just to push through, and maybe certain kinds of threats are easier to be like, no, this is not going to happen. Um, to what extent, like, the blockages reflect features of the situation, the stimulus, or like attitudes, goals of the perceiver or the possible empathizer? I mean, I think for me, like, for both of your different approaches, like, how do we think about what empathy regulators are doing? How much of this reflects kind of person by situation interactions between, like, the goals that any of us might have approaching a specific context and the affordances that a particular challenging empathy opportunity or risk creates for us. So maybe to kind of, as like one of our last points, like, what do you make of that? Like, how do we think about those interactions?
Um, so I like now both of your balanced view on that, and I agree. I mean, first of all, to my own challenge here, I mean, do we owe other people empathy, and especially now people who are suspicious to us or so? My answer, to make that more simple, I would say no, we actually don't ever owe people empathy. However, and that's exactly the point here is, and Sarah stressed that, of course, a lot in this time and these challenging times here, is to say it would, however, be good if we could get to that point. the other person may not resolve that. We don't owe it to them. But we may actually, if we can do it without harming ourselves, it might be good for us to learn that muscle, to also challenge ourselves, to also reach out to other people who have an uncomfortable position or seem to be traitors or difficult. Or the ones, to use the word from Daryl's reference, I mean, Robert Kurzban, um, who talks about, in one word, bystander coordination. There's these roadblocks, as you described it, and bystanders decide who is right and who's wrong. But sometimes we may also want to kind of go back to that and say, well, sometimes it's not so easy. To also challenge ourselves. And I do like, I would always say, I like that, to say it's a growth opportunity for us to challenge ourselves sometimes, to also go where it's not as easy, but it's not an ethical duty.
To me, it sounds like we just have a paper in progress at this point, so it'll be exciting to see how that goes.
That sounds great. I mean, I like the idea that it's like the conditions for possibility of empathy. It's something that it's almost like it's a challenge. It's nice to know the skills are there and that I'm ready to use them if I wanted to, even if based upon my moral position, I'm choosing not to for very good reasons in this moment. I like that distinction because I think the capacity motivation piece, I think we've all talked about it in different ways at different times, but I think the idea of still cultivating it as a latent possibility for ourselves, even if in the moment we say no. That I think that particular framing would be really interesting to develop. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the moment, it's not that we're saying no, it's that we're saying yes to one group or person and no to another. But yes, I cultivating that latent, whatever you said sounded good.
Well, yeah. Did any of you have any last thoughts? I realize we're a few minutes over. Did any of you have any last thoughts or questions? I'm also happy to call it a day, and we can think about a paper this afternoon or something. Um,
No, this is really great. I was actually really happy to see Fritz's conversation and took a lot of notes. And I think there's a lot of food for thought. I think there are ways to integrate different perspectives and, like empathy, the science of empathy hasn't been as theoretical as it could be. And I think we could kind of put together some ideas of how do we reconcile like the dark sides with the bright sides and what does that really look like in a moral sense.
Yeah. And I also, yeah, I agree. First of all, thank you, Daryl, for bringing us together, nagging us, making sure that we really do reply to your messages, which is always difficult. We are all cat people, so it's herding cats, obviously. So um, I have cats too, but they're not here in this library here right now. But I agree, and I also, one of the things that um, um, I also took a lot of notes from Sarah's talk, of course, here. And I'm still, I mean, this self-oriented and other-oriented empathy distinction, it makes a lot of sense intuitively, but in the moment that I look at my dark sides, it ends up breaking down a little bit more. So there's some theoretical level that is also tricky for me to reach.
Yeah, and I think trying to, if we were to pursue something with this, like trying to think about like what is the right connection between the psychological and the ethical levels of analysis. I mean, some of the work that I've done, thinking about well, what is the, if we accept that motivations and our values can shape some of these empathy gaps, um, in really be practically livable, like recognizable ways. The dangers of empathizing with someone who wants to see your tears, that kind of those kinds of things. Understanding like the psychological causes behind some of these choices we make, but then how does that pivot into what are the normative implications of that? Like is if we see the blockages, I mean, one thing from your talk is like if we see the blockages and it's framed very much through the lens of these are choices we make. I mean, I think I like your normative framing at the end because I think it implies that empathy isn't necessarily always good or always bad. It could be any of these things depending upon the context in which we deploy certain and respond to different blockages. And I think trying to navigate like how do we link up the psychological level with normative level and use that to advance theory and empathy research across disciplines. I mean, that's what I've been really fascinated with. And I think you're two like the three-person group here is it's an interesting way to try to reckon with some of those questions. Well,
Sounds like a great paper we should kind of investigate. I mean, how to set up a framework for this even. So
well, I'm always happy to chat more. And thank you both for joining me for the second session. Thank you all the guests who are still with us. And um, yeah, we have the last session next week with Valerie Tiberius, who was here in the audience, and Simone Chimay-Sori, talking about empathy and learning and wisdom. Um, Thank you, Sarah and Fritz. I look forward to chatting more. All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you.